Salam hörmətli izləyicilər. Hər bizi xoş gördük. Bugünkü webinarımız bildiyiniz kimi James Robinson'dan olacaq. Biz ingiliscə olacaq webinar, çünki bizim webinarlar silsiləsində xarici qonaqların olan webinarlarımız həmişə ingiliscə olacaq. Bunu sizə bildirmək istəyərdik. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, actually this evening. Today we are hosting one of the most prominent political scientists and economists of our times, Professor James Robinson from the University of Chicago. Welcoming you is the co-chairman of Azerbaijan Science Association and the graduate of London School of Economics and Political Science, which is the university our guest speaker has also graduated from many, many years ago. Thank you for accepting our invitation for the speech.
My pleasure, yes, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you again. Before proceeding to the main part of our webinar, we will have a very short introduction to our viewers about our association and your background, academic profile. So, Azerbaijan Science Association was established in December 2016 by a group of UK alumni from different British universities. Association organizes a number of projects ranging from the production of videos, infographics, articles, to the organization of seminars and webinars. We are currently having webinars because of the current circumstances which don't allow us to organize seminars. We need to maintain social distancing, and we had to switch to webinars, but we will have webinar and seminar parallel, going hand in hand from now onwards. And that's it from us. So I am passing the floor to my colleague. She will introduce the academic background and profile of our Professor James Robinson. Please, Abutab, it's your turn.
Good evening. I'm Abutab Abbasova, graduate of SOAS, University of London, and currently working in the education sector. I would like to introduce Professor Robinson. So James Robinson is a prominent political scientist and economist. He's currently a professor at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. So he studied economics at the London School of Economics, the University of Warwick, and received his PhD degree from Yale University. He has previously taught at University of Melbourne, University of Southern California, University of California at Berkeley, and Harvard University. His research interests include economic and political development, political economy and comparative politics, among many. As you might have heard, he's the co-author of Why Nations Fail, where the role of institutions was particularly emphasized in answering the main question posed. It's nice to see you here, Professor Robinson. Dear listeners, I'm also welcoming you. Please feel free to ask your questions. I will be posing them to Professor Robinson afterwards. And Inglap, it's your turn.
Thank you. Now we'll start our webinar. So I'm sure everyone would agree with me that the current crisis is unprecedented in the history of mankind. It's a crisis not caused by financial institutions or anything related to finance. It was caused by public health crisis. So the consequences are very different from the ones we had back in 2008 or very, very back in the 1920s when we had Great Depression. So people understandably are very, very pessimistic, especially in the parts of the world where we have low oil prices, and plus we have COVID-19. So we have two crises at the same time. People look for guidance, and I believe that people like Professor James Robinson can provide guidance and also can provide some comfort to the people who have questions on the recovery of economy, how the country will recover. Will we have normal life again? Or any other question related to the economic and sociological aspects of COVID-19 are something our professor will talk about today. So he will have presentation. After presentation, we will have question-answer session. So please feel free to provide your questions. Now, Professor, it's your turn, so you can start your presentation.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for inviting me. And let me share my screen here. I would say that just responding to some of the issues you raised, there's so much uncertainty about everything at the moment. Even medical people don't really understand fully, the virus, the transmission, the recurrence, what it takes to have immunity. There's no vaccine. There's, so there's enormous amount of uncertainty. So anything I say is bound to be pretty speculative. But I wanted to just, one could focus on many things and many questions. And if I don't address something that people find interesting, then they can ask me questions about it. But I just put together some thoughts about what seem to be the main issues from my perspective as a political economist who studies political institutions and political development and governance and the relationship between governance and economic development. So, when I sat down and thought about this, again, there's many things one could focus on. There's sort of, for a social scientist, there's fascinating variation in the reaction of different countries to this pandemic. Some countries, perhaps because of the history of viruses, like SARS or whatever, were much better prepared, like Taiwan and South Korea, when they became aware of the problem, and they were able to spring into action very rapidly, and the reactions elsewhere were very different. In China and China and the US both shared a sort of, they went into a kind of denial syndrome. The Chinese woke up from it faster. The US are still struggling with that. So one could talk about many things here, but what I wanted to talk about is a sort of what I call it seems to me fundamental contradiction, about the reaction of society or potential reaction of society to the spread of the virus. So on the one hand, this sort of pandemic is which we haven't really seen anything like it, in the modern era. Perhaps if one went back to the medieval times and started talking about the Black Death, then you have something on an even larger scale. But it, in some sense, it's a Hobbesian issue. If you go back, to Thomas Hobbes's book Leviathan, which is one of the founding works in modern political philosophy, Hobbes, was writing during the English Civil War, a time of enormous kind of chaos and disorder and disorientation. And he emphasized that, in such a context, there's a huge demand for a powerful central state to just take over and provide order, and it seems to me that the pandemic, it's very scary. People don't really know how to catch it, how to avoid it, what the consequences are. Are they going to die? Are they going to survive? If they survive, will they be reinfected? Well, it's a very Hobbesian issue. It's a very visceral. People are scared. People want security. They want the state. They want protection. They want the government to do something. This is exactly what Hobbes was talking about. And Hobbes uses exactly this expression. People are willing in such a context to sacrifice their wills to the state. And it's clear that we do need more. We need controls. We need more global governance. We need more coordination. This is an international issue. This is not something one country can deal with on its own. So there is a clear need for more state. But at the same time, this issue appears, at least in Western countries, many Western countries, I think, the different parts of the world obviously are very different. It occurs in Western countries with historically low levels of trust in the state or belief in the ability of the state to solve problems. In some sense, in the Western world, particularly the Anglo-Saxon world, since the time when I was a student at the London School of Economics, when Mrs. Thatcher came to power in 1979, there's been a downward trend in trust in the state. As I quote here Ronald Reagan, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." The United States currently is run by an administration that doesn't really believe in the government. President Trump has been spending his entire time since he came to power deinstitutionalizing the federal state. shutting down bureaus and things that would have helped us respond and anticipate the crisis. President Trump's is a sort of libertarian. He just thinks business people should be allowed to do whatever they like without taxes or regulation. And suddenly we need the state, you know, and he doesn't know how to cope with it. And we're in this context, you know, if you look, and here's some data from the Pew Research Center have been monitoring these things for many years. This is data on basically the trust in government amongst members of, you know, so this is broken down by different political parties. So you can actually see that whether or not people are Republicans or Democrats, there's been a downward trend. I mean, this antedates, of course, 1980 even. The trend is downward since 1980, but you see, even before that, the trend is there. People trust much less the state, you know, across the political spectrum in the United States. This is true also in Western Europe. The downward trend is much smaller and much less distinct in Western Europe, but the same pattern is there. So just when you really need the state, you're at a situation of kind of all-time low trust in the state. Okay, so that's what I mean by a contradiction, and it seems to me that creates a sort of fundamental problem of governance for societies like this. Again, you know, this may be very different in different parts of the world. I'll say a little bit about China, but to me, you know, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. You know, it sounds like a recipe for disaster. You have a desperate need for something, but you have this very skeptical society. Okay, and I think that this problem is, in some senses, exacerbated by the nature of the COVID-19 shock. You know, one thing that's just kind of really struck me about the impact of the shock in the United States is the enormous impact on inequality. You know, somebody like me, and this is maybe about a third of the labor force, that's what economists have been estimating, it's very easy to move home. You know, I'm sitting here talking to you in my office at home. You know, I can come home, I can teach on Zoom, I can carry on with my research. I have to deal with my sons. You know, that's the biggest problem because the schools are closed, you know, and my wife is here, she's teaching, she's working, researching. It's very easy for us to move home. Nobody's going to cut our pay. We're not unemployed. Think about the consequences for low-skilled people. You can't move home and work at home if you're a truck driver or a bus driver, or you're facing massive unemployment risk, loss of income. How do you cope with your children? And if you have to keep working, you know, like essential workers, like the people in the meat packing factory that President Trump decided were essential workers, that's not a big issue for me because I'm a vegetarian, but it is for some people, I suppose. Those people, not only, they also face much higher risk of contracting the disease, of becoming ill. It's very easy for us, you know, highly educated people to do social distancing. So one of the things, you know, it seems to me that's undermined the kind of belief in the way the state functions, at least in the, you know, the Anglo-Saxon world in particular, is this rising inequality. And so now we have an enormous increase in inequality as a consequence of this. It's not just inequality, it's also, you know, what I'm calling here social dislocation. You know, my ex-colleague, Robert Putnam, in his book, Bowling Alone, pointed out that one of the dramatic things that have been happening in the United States over this period, the same period in which decline in this trust in the state had occurred, is an enormous decline in what he called civic engagement. You know, so he used this metaphor of bowling alone. Now Americans don't go out bowling, you know, to kind of activities with friends, and, you know, we're much more nuclear, we're much more isolated. You know, so he mapped the decline in membership of different associations and groups and clubs in the period since 1960, you know, and that goes along with many other forms of social solidarity, like trade unions. You know, trade unions, it's hard to imagine that back in the 1950s, a third of US workers were members of trade unions, but trade unionism has been on a decline, you know, since the steep decline since the late 1960s and early 1970s. So many aspects of associational life and social solidarity have been collapsing. And, you know, what about the effect of this shock on, you know, this is data from the City University of New York Graduate School that's been kind of doing a very high frequency data collection exercise on the telephone in New York City. And, you know, so this is from their survey, April 17, April 19. You know, of the people they contacted, 40% feel anxious, 32% feel depressed, 43% feel they have no social connections. It's very isolating. The whole experience is very isolating, you know, and I want to say that, you know, that has disastrous social consequences. It further encourages this breakdown of social, what Robert Putnam called social capital. And, you know, of course, that's intimately connected with this rise in inequality, I think. So it has very bad social consequences, you know, the nature of the shock and adapting to the shock. And, you know, at exactly the time, you know, when you need to be working on the fundamentals that have created skepticism about the state and disillusion with institutions. You know, why is President Trump the president of the United States? Because many people have become very disillusioned with the way the institutions work in the US, okay? So I see, you know, the way I see this is that there's a possibility for very divergent outcomes, you know, two very different paths going forward. And I tried to come up with a little diagram to illustrate this. You know, I don't know how nerdy the audience members are, you know, who watch this, but think of this in the following way. You know, there's on the vertical axis, I'm going to call this the increase in state responsibilities. You know, the state has to do things. It has to regulate society and businesses. It has to monitor people. You know, and on the horizontal axis is the kind of the extent of trust in state institutions. This vertical distance here between the axis and this dotted line is the necessary increase in state responsibilities. It's the increase in state responsibilities which are needed to deal with the problem. Okay, monitoring, social distance, contact tracing, etc. Okay, this red line here is the extent to which society will allow the state to take on more responsibilities. And this is increasing in trust. So the more you trust the state, the more willing you are to allow the state to take on these more responsibilities, to build its capacity. Because if you trust it, you trust that these capacities won't be misused and that you can control them and there will be some element of accountability. So the red line, that's what the red line is. It shows you how the extent of trust in society determines the extent to which people are willing to let the state take on these more responsibilities. Okay, so now the real problem is, you know, where the intersection of this dotted line and the red line is. Okay, because if you're to the right to that, you're fine, because that says the initial level of trust you have in the state is sufficiently large that you're willing to allow the state to take on all these new roles and responsibilities because you trust that they'll be well used in the interests of society. But if you're to the left of that point, then there's a huge problem, because the responsibilities that the state has to take on are so large that people just don't trust that the state will use those responsibly. And, you know, what worries me most about the United States is where we are. Are we to the left of X, or are we to the right of X? And when I say divergence, I mean, imagine you're to the right of X. Well, you trust the state. The state takes on these responsibilities. You're successful at fighting the virus. You can adapt to information. You learn. Trust goes up. Okay. So to the left, the state needs to take on these responsibilities, but society doesn't trust it to use them in a responsible way. So there's a conflict, there's resistance, you know, of the sort of resistance that we've seen in the United States, you know. So people are protesting, you know, against the governor of Michigan, you know, and here's an extraordinary picture. You know, here are people with, you know, assault rifles on the steps of Michigan Capitol, you know. So this, what is this? This is people who are, you know, it's a minority, hopefully, but, you know, here are people saying, you know, we're not going to cooperate with the government because we don't trust the government. And, you know, there's been decades of inculcating that kind of attitude in the United States. And, you know, this is where the chickens really come home to roost. Okay, so that's, you know, that's what am I doing? Yeah. So that's you know, this is sort of what I mean here. Okay, that's a situation of declining trust, and you know, the state fails to cope with the problems, and you know, and I think that, you know, whether or not that's happening in the US is kind of playing out every day. You know, there's enormous contestation of a lot of these state-driven rules and regulations. Now, one reaction to this, you know, which I've heard a lot discussing this with people, is let me come back to authoritarian regimes. Is no, hold on a second. You know, there's other mechanisms at work here. You know, couldn't this crisis bring people together? You know, first of all, couldn't it reveal in a country like the United States, and I'm talking mostly about the United States or the Anglo-Saxon world. I understand, you know, things are very different elsewhere, and I'm happy to, you know, field questions about that. You know, but just, you know, you could push back and say, okay, hold on, but there's much more grounds for optimism than that. You know, couldn't it be that in the United States, the crisis is going to reveal that you need a stronger state? All this downsizing, you know, of state institutions that's occurred since the Reagan-Thatcher revolution is a terrible mistake. You know, we never anticipated something like this could happen, and now we know it can happen, and we need to prepare. You know, and so that's creating a sort of consensus about the need to respond to this shock. You know, there's many arguments, you know, in social science, for example, about wars. You know, there was a famous argument made about the origin of the social insurance and the national health system in Britain, and a lot of, you know, social insurance following the Second World War. That, you know, the Second World War was a sort of great mixing thing. You know, the army brought together elites, non-elites, upper class people, poor people. They all got together and kind of understood each other's problems. It's called the contact hypothesis in social psychology. And that people empathized, and they understood, and they developed a kind of collective spirit that hadn't existed in Britain until that time. And that allowed for much more public good provision, for socialization of health, and many things that the Labour government did in the wake of its victory in 1945. But I don't, you know, so it could be that this is happening today. But actually, I don't see that at all in the United States. Maybe it's happening in other parts of the world. But, you know, this is a remarkable graph that the New York Times published about different attitudes across the political spectrum towards coronavirus. Okay, so this is the proportion of people that answered, you know, a question. You know, to what extent were they extremely concerned about the coronavirus outbreak, state by state? Okay, and blue are Democrats and red are Republicans. So you can see that, and this is absolutely uniform across all states, you know, it's not just all the states, is that Democrats are much more concerned about coronavirus than Republicans are. Like, why on earth would that be true? This is a public health issue, you know, it's about epidemiology and medicine, you know, it's like, it's scientific, it's factual. It's like, why would you have, because of this incredible political polarization. So this is, you know, talking about social psychology, this is what people would call motivated reasoning. You know, you interpret evidence through your prior beliefs about society. So, you know, if you're a Republican and somebody tells you, you know, that there's, you know, we need to do social distancing and the government needs to shut down things, you immediately don't believe them, you know, because it's the government telling you, and you're anti-government, and the government can't do anything right, just like Ronald Reagan said. So I see, you know, that enormous, those beliefs are almost more polarized now than they were at the start of the coronavirus. So this isn't much evidence for this type of mechanism of, you know, people coming together or some greater social consensus emerging. I don't see that. I don't see that at all. Okay. And, you know, talking about the Second World War and elites being isolated, you know, one of the famous examples, you know, of disasters and social cohesion is the Netherlands. You know, so in the Netherlands, if the North Sea flooded, everyone drowned. You know, the elites drowned, the, you know, non-elites drowned, everyone drowned. Republicans drowned, Democrats drowned. You know, so in the Middle Ages, in the Netherlands, there was this enormous investment in building these polders, in building, you know, public goods which protected society, because elites couldn't isolate themselves. And there's actually, you know, there's really interesting work on this. This is going to be too complicated to talk about, I realize, but there was a fabulous book written by Werner Trusken, who's sadly passed away, a great economic historian, about the origin of public service provision, particularly sewers in US cities. And he showed that, basically, these governments were, this is sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, Black people were mostly disenfranchised, so they couldn't really, this especially in these two southern cities, this is Memphis and Savannah, Black people couldn't actually vote to get public services, but they got public services when they were mixed up with white people. So in providing public services to themselves, white people inadvertently helped Black people. But when the Black people were isolated geographically, they didn't get public services, but I don't think this crisis is like the polders, or it's not like the polders in the Netherlands, and in fact, what's this social isolation doing? Elites are much more able to isolate themselves. So for me, if anything, the reaction to the crisis is making elites even more isolated from society than they were to start with, at least in the United States. Final kind of grounds for optimism, an example that comes up, is the famous Managua earthquake. Here's General Somoza, the dictator of Nicaragua, in 1972, when this earthquake flattened Managua, and international relief flooded in, and he stole it all. And in fact, if you've been to Managua, you'll know that basically they never rebuilt the city. They just kind of moved it. They moved it, away from the lake. The old city is still there, sort of destroyed. It's an amazing thing. And this revealed to Nicaraguans the corruption and incapacity of the Somoza dictatorship. This is the story, and it facilitated the Sandinista revolution that overthrew. So it kind of, again, it created kind of a cohesion amongst people in society, elites and non-elites, indeed. If you look at the first Sandinista government, it was actually not just a bunch of communist rebels like Fidel Castro. There were all sorts of people on it, Violeta Chamorro and elites and kind of wealthy people, because this brought them together. That's the argument. So could it just reveal the staggering incapacity, of the Trump administration and forge some consensus that, we just can't live like that in the United States anymore? Maybe. I don't see it at the moment, but maybe. Okay. So let me say something about authoritarian regimes before I shut up. This business of people kind of allow, the level of trust sort of indicating, the increase in government responsibilities that people are willing to live with. You could say, well, that doesn't apply to China. China doesn't care about that. China just does it. It doesn't consult people. And, Confucius in the Analects, if you ever read Confucius's Analects, he says the people do not debate government. That's 2,500 years ago, and it's still like that in China. So does that analysis apply to China? And I think it may apply to China. We're going into a world now where globalization is going to contract. I think there's no doubt about that. Trade is going to contract. Mobility, people's mobility is going to contract. And for the last 40 years, after the collapse of, there's still a notional commitment to communism in China, but in practice, the Chinese government legitimates itself by being able to deliver on economic growth. And that economic growth is based on specialization, exporting, taking advantage of world trade. If world trade contracts, Chinese growth, which was already, there was a lot of catch-up growth there. So Chinese growth was already naturally going to slow down. It's going to slow down dramatically, okay? And so that you can't legitimize itself. You can't legitimize yourself by generating economic growth. So if you can't legitimize yourself by generating economic growth, you've got to legitimize yourself in other ways, it seems to me. You no longer legitimize yourself through ideology, or belief that we're building a socialist society, then it's economic growth. What else? So yes, it could be that even if the trust, people in China and the state is low, say some level Y, which is less than X, which is this kind of critical point, the Chinese government can just take on the capacities anyway. It can just increase whatever responsibilities it needs to do, because that's just how things work in China. But that creates that also creates a problem, it seems to me, what I call the legitimacy gap. You know, it's going to create strain, and even in an authoritarian system which can just take on these powers, you know, China's not going to have armed gunmen complaining, you know, outside the mayor's office in Wuhan, because you just can't do that in China. Those people will be arrested and sent off to labor camps, you know. But China also rests on social cohesion, and it rests on some fundamental cooperation with the state. You know, you can't substitute, you know, you can't use drones to substitute some basic social contract. And I do think there is, that social contract is there in China, even though it is an authoritarian system, because there's a deep history. It has a deep history. You know, I quoted Confucius, you know, and President Xi is very keen on quoting Confucius, by the way. Why does he do that? Because he is trying to evoke a very deeply historically rooted social contract in China. And, you know, and so you know, to me, that's evidence that they do need this social contract to work, and they're aware of that. And you know, and so I don't think authoritarian countries are completely you know, they can't completely escape from this logic. Okay, let me kind of wrap up. So what do you do about this? You know, particularly what do you do, you know, if you're not to the right of X, which I'm a little concerned about in the United States. You know, and in Why Nations Fail, you mentioned our book Why Nations Fail, soon to be in Azerbaijan. We're having an Azerbaijan language translation, which I'm very excited about. And I'm hoping to come, you know, and launch the book in Baku. I'd be very excited to do that. You know, what do you do? You know, what do you do if you're, you know, to the left of X in this situation? Okay. Well, I think, you know, to me, it's like two obvious things. You know, one obviously is you try to implement policies which can sort of impact, you know, provide, you know, which can impact the negative effects of this shock. You know, obvious things like social insurance and healthcare. You know, it's absolutely remarkable in the United States that there's no mandated federal policy on how many sick days a year you can get. You know, how many days can you be ill and still receive payment? There's no federal rules on that. It's all completely decentralized to the states. You know, there's some guidance on unemployment insurance, but it's a completely chaotic situation. So you know, healthcare, social insurance, you know, obvious things. I mean, I think here there's enormous scope for clever technological ways of trying to bridge this collapse of, you know, social capital, and try to find ways of bringing people together, or create new sorts of associational life, you know, and try to find creative technological solutions for that. You know, and I think also, you know, that's the first obvious thing. The other thing is, you know, if the state has to take on more roles and more responsibilities, you need to find a way of increasing people's trust and confidence in the state. And I think, you know, one of the main themes of, you mentioned Why Nations Fail, you know, one of the main themes of our new book, The Narrow Corridor, which came out late last year, we don't have an Azerbaijan translation lined up yet, but I'm hoping. One of the themes in our new book is that the state and society have to move together. You can't have a situation where the state takes on a lot more responsibilities without society also growing, you know, and developing its capacity to monitor and control the state. Okay, so you know, so what does that mean in practice? Well, here's some very US kind of centric ways of thinking about that. You know, the governor of Illinois, for example, who I think is doing a very good job relative to many other people, the governor of Illinois, you know, he announces all these controls, all these restrictions, and, you know, by fiat. So is there not some way of giving people more ownership in this? You know, there's a lot of kind of low-level rebellion against these regulations. You know, for example, on Sunday, my wife and I went to these woods where we like going with our son to go walking, where there are a lot of lakes and birds and wildlife. They closed all the car parks. So what did people do? People just parked. Hundreds of cars were just parked along the roads. You know, people just parked and they entered these woods illegally. You know, so so there's sort of, you know, you need people to cooperate. You can barricade the car park, but people can park on the road. And what are you going to do? Just start arresting hundreds of people? You're going to have a riot on your hands. So you need those people to cooperate. And why aren't they cooperating? Because they don't feel consulted. They don't understand the necessity of this. So that people need more ownership in the measures, you know? And there are many ways to improve accountability. Let me give you since I'm sitting in Chicago, in Illinois, let me give you the example of Illinois' gerrymandered 4th Congressional District. You know, so this may be the most gerrymandered. What do I mean by gerrymandered? So here is the 4th Congressional District, okay? So everybody in this dark green area vote for a congressperson. Why on earth does it look like that? It looks like that because it's strategically drawn to make sure that Hispanics only elect one congressperson, okay? So you just put all the Hispanic people in one district and make sure they only get one congressperson, okay? So this is an egregious example of this, but this is absolutely commonplace throughout the United States in the Congress. Not at the state, of course, but in the Congress, you have this incredible gerrymandering, right? This is just blatantly undemocratic. It's blatantly designed to reduce accountability and representation, okay? So why on earth doesn't something about that happen? It just so happens that this is about to come up in the Supreme Court. You know, here's a good moment for the Supreme Court justices to take a stand on, you know, some democratic principles in this country. There's enormous use of strategies for disenfranchisement, disenfranchising felons and former prisoner, purging voter rolls, all extremely partisan, okay? This is not a moment, you know, for engaging in partisan activities. You know, this is a potentially enormously critical moment in this country's governance, you know, and there's lots of ways you could improve accountability in ways that would give people more trust in the institutions. So I think, I don't know that any of that's going to happen. You know, I showed you that data, how incredibly polarized, you know, we're not talking about, you know, the money supply or something. We're talking about people's attitudes towards a disease. There should be, why are there partisan differences between people's assessment of the threat of coronavirus? That is, to me, is just so depressing as a statement about this country at the moment, about the context in which this is happening. And, you know, that's why I emphasize this sort of theme in the lecture. So I think I made that point, and there's so many things we could talk about. Why don't I shut up and you ask me questions?
Thank you very much for very, very interesting and actually revealing presentation. Actually, some of the things that were very new to me personally, I believe to our team as well, and to our viewers as well. So thank you for very interesting presentation. Now we'll have question and answer session. The first question is actually not related to the presentation itself, but to the general economy, global economy. So your book on Why Nations Fail talk about the countries which are economically developed, which have normally functioning institutions, which are more or less accountable. And we have countries where we have no accountability and economies operate very different. They don't operate on the same principles as in the UK or US or Anglo-Saxon system. So will COVID-19 widen the gap in terms of economic development, the level of economic development between, let's say, Western countries or Eastern European countries, or let's say Southeast Asia and Western Europe? Will we see divergence into a widening gap between countries, or will we recover to the pre-crisis levels in short term? What's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very complicated question. I think I see a lot of variation within developed countries, but obviously, you know, if you looked at underdeveloped countries like Africa, you know, African countries have terrible healthcare systems. You know, most people don't have access to proper healthcare. There's going to be enormous mortality and consequences, you know, even though they have, you know, they tend to have relatively young populations compared to developing countries. You know, like one of the, you know, if you just look at the kind of age burden of the disease, that's much less of a problem in Africa because the healthcare is so terrible that, you know, you have far fewer older people around still alive. But I would say this is going to be an enormous economic crisis in Africa. But you know, the variation is there's a lot of variation. You know, think about India. You know, I always think India is like that. You know, Indian society is based around social distancing. It's called the caste system. You know, the caste system is all about high caste people social distancing themselves from lower caste people. And it's actually interesting, if you look at the data, India seems to be doing very well, but that doesn't surprise me at all because that's just how Indian society works, you know. So some countries may be able to cope. They may have actually sort of features of their society that allow them to cope better or worse. But I would say, you know, the bigger picture surely is that this is going to widen differences between poor and rich countries, because poor countries really, they lack the state capacity and they lack the healthcare systems, you know, which are desperately needed to and how do you do social distancing, you know, in a shanty town in Lagos in Nigeria, you know, or in Kenya or you know, or Brazil, or it's just so difficult, or wash your hands when you have no running water, you know.
Thank you for your providing your take. Now I pass the floor to my colleague. She will ask the questions from our viewers. The next questions, please.
So we've got one question from Zulfia saying that what do you think socialism handles COVID-19 better than capitalism in this situation, or it's vice versa, considering the case of China? So also, like, I don't think
there's anything really socialist about China, to be honest with you. I think that, you know, like, I'm not sure, you know, socialism and capitalism is not really a distinction I use very much. You know, I think most countries that used to have a, you know, avowedly socialist ideology don't really have that anymore. You know, is North Korea a socialist country, you know, or is it a personalized dictatorship? You know, is Cuba a socialist country? Obviously, you know, Cuba has some elements left over from socialism, you know, kind of more egalitarian distribution of property and, you know, more egalitarian and kind of more inclusive educational system, which were legacies of communism. But again, you know, it's much more like a personal dictatorship than, so I don't really see that one can even make a statement about the difference between capitalism and socialism, because I don't use that terminology. I mean, that's a bigger it's a bigger reason. I mean, that's a longer discussion why I don't use that terminology. I mean, we prefer inclusive and extractive, you know, because we don't see a big difference between North Korea and, you know, dictatorships in other parts of the world. So I don't really see that distinction.
Okay, so we've got another question saying that considering that economists argue that now we are going to the depression at the moment rather than like even having the recession. So what they're saying, like also considering the huge, like high levels of unemployment rate, do you think, is there any possibility that we enter into the depression period in the future? I mean, because of the crisis. If yes, when are you predicting this to happen?
No, I think you know, I think what we've learned in the past, especially in the 1980s, you know, from unemployment problems, is that, you know, a kind of very powerful negative economic shock, like we had, for example, with the Volcker deflation. You know, it's starting in the late 1970s and early 1980s in the United States, with this enormous increase in interest rates and very contractionary monetary policy. Is that, you know, I mean, of course, this is not what's causing the recession now, because interest rates are basically zero and monetary policy is massively expansionary. But you have an enormous kind of government enforced recession in some sense. You know, that it's a sort of fascinating from a social scientific point of view that the government is kind of forcing firms to close and, you know, forcing them in effect to lay people off, and, you know, is kind of creating unemployment by fiat. So I think what we know from what's interesting to learn from the 1980s, though, is that there's enormous potential irreversibilities here. You know, what economists call, you know, hysteresis, that you know, if you have a contraction like this, which is long enough, firms go bankrupt, you know, workers get unemployed, they lose labor market attachment. Once a firm has gone bankrupt, it's very difficult to restart it. Of course, you know, you have bankrupt procedures and you have, you know, you have mechanisms for protecting firms from going out of business and restructuring their assets or whatever. But those are really designed for normal times when some firms are going bankrupt, but other firms are healthy, and you know, but when everyone's going bankrupt, that's then those mechanisms don't work so well. So I think there's an enormous anxiety here about how long we can sustain this situation of closing businesses, zero revenues, you know, laying people off. Firms don't know whether to make a commitment to keep paying people or not, or, you know, but I think that, you know, and I suspect that in June, you know, I mean, in the United States, some states are already, you know, like Georgia, you know, they're all, Alaska, they're already trying to open and start the economy going again. Let's see what happens, you know, with that. But I do think there's a danger of an enormous contraction, because, you know, even if the US or whatever opens up, world trade is going to contract massively, you know, because movement of people is going to contract, trade is going to contract, because even if you've got coronavirus under control in the United States or anywhere else, you're going to be worried about it being reinfected coming from outside. So there's going to be, you know, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, you know, who's a lady I like a lot, you know, she's saying, you know, we're going to be isolated for a long time, you know, in New Zealand. And so that's going to lead to economic contraction, you know, even if all of these domestic constraints are lifted. So I think there's an enormous possibility that, you know, we're going to enter a decade of very high unemployment, and there's going to be a very severe economic contraction and very slow recovery because of this contraction of international trade.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. So I can understand that it's going to be kind of a U-shaped recovery rather than V-shaped as quick as we expect it to happen.
Yeah, I think it's this contraction of the global economy which is going to be the main thing which is going to keep growth very low. I don't see that can possibly unravel quickly. You know, you can get the domestic economy going again, you know, in a month or 2 months or whatever, but you can't. The world trade is a different thing. It seems to me that there's going to be enormous reluctance to go back to where we were.
So what do you think, like, which sectors in the economy will be affected from the crisis more in comparison to other?
Well, I think it's very interesting. You know, I think that, you know, if you have a prolonged contraction in world trade, it's going to have all sorts of interesting consequences structurally. You know, it's going to lead to demand for sectors that were previously uncompetitive internationally are going to bounce back, you know, I don't know. I haven't really thought that through, but I think there will be very important consequences. Yes.
Okay, maybe Inga, you can ask some questions.
I'll direct the next question. It's about institutions, which you talk about on your book very, very widely. So do you think COVID-19 will provide momentum to institutional reform? So we'll have a very different governance in many parts of the world. Or will we be the same as it was before once the fear is over?
Well, I think I was trying to use my little diagram to talk about that. I think that depends whether you're to the left or the right of X. You know, I think you know, you see in some European countries, you know, like Germany, for example. You know, Germany has reacted they reacted very fast. They did enormous amount of testing. They were much better at controlling things. There's a huge surge in sort of trust and positive attitudes towards the government, particularly, you know, the Chancellor Merkel. And, you know, I see that as a kind of, that's actually a positive thing. The government reacted effectively, you know, and people trust the state in Germany. Or Sweden, you know, in Sweden, you know, they were much less controlling in the way they approached this. You know, why is that? Because there's so much social capital in Sweden, you know, like people obey the rules, they, you know, like there's so much kind of education and communication with the government, and, you know, then you can sort of move people, you know, in a much more kind of voluntary, you know, cooperative way, you know. I think my example I was telling you about the cars that the people parked on the road in the woods show you that wouldn't work in the United States. You know, it doesn't, people, there's just not that degree of cooperation with the government. You know, if they hadn't closed the car parks and just said, don't go to the woods, you know, people would not have obeyed the government, you know. So I think, you know, I see like this, I see, you know, that, you know, this is, I don't know what the consequences would be in Africa or developing countries. I think probably very, very heterogeneous, you know. But you know, I think there's a sort of, there's going to be a kind of divergence, you know, and in Europe, it may well, you know, strengthen the social contract in some dimensions, you know, and maybe Boris Johnson and the Conservative government, after Boris Johnson was so ill and his life was saved by the National Health Service, the Conservative government will change their policy of running it down for the past 40 years. Yeah, and that would be a good thing. You know, speaking as someone who lives in the United States for many years, you know, I grew to, the health system here is so crazy and chaotic. You know, if you're wealthy, you have extremely high quality healthcare. You know, but the fact that millions of people don't have access to healthcare in this country is just an outrage, you know. And you know, one thing that's going to happen also, which is very interesting, is that millions of people are going to get COVID-19. They're going to go to hospital. They don't have health insurance. They're going to come out of hospital owing $100,000. You know, after home mortgage debt in the United States, the biggest source of consumer debt are unpaid medical bills. And that's going to be interesting, you know. It's going to be interesting what the consequence of that is. Millions of people, millions are going to have suddenly hundreds of thousands of unpaid hospital debts, you know. And in this country, you know, they collect on that. You know, the hospital will sell the debt to debt collectors, and they'll come and they'll take your car, they'll take your television, you know. It's a really brutal business. Yeah. So you know, there's so many consequences here to think through. But as I say, I see this divergence, you know, so which is good, you know, bad depending on where you are. Yeah.
Thank you. Please, it's your turn.
Yeah. Also, like, we've got an interesting question from Arzu Abbasova, saying that you mentioned about the trust and accountability in tackling COVID-19. What is so hypocritical is that the Western media and the governments called the measures taken by the Chinese government as draconian several times. However, now they're implementing the same exact measures. The tracking apps and increased state surveillance seems necessary at this point, but also it's a direct interference to personal privacy. How shall this society monitor the state at this point, and how states still keep the accountability to the people?
Well, I wouldn't agree with that description. You know, like the government, you know, the governor of Illinois is democratically appointed. You know, this is a representative democracy. In a representative democracy, we delegate tasks to politicians that we democratically elect, and the governor is taking on the task. So I think the measures that the governor is adopting are very different from the measures, you know, similar or not, that the Chinese government is adopting, because nobody popularly elected the government in China. That's the Communist Party runs the country without any democratic procedures. So I think it's incorrect. It's fundamentally incorrect to say that's the same thing. You know, this is a country with representative democracy, and that man, Governor Pritzker, has a mandate. You know, he has a mandate to run Illinois, and if we don't like the way he runs Illinois, we'll get rid of him at the next election. That's not a possibility in China. So I just resist that characterization. It's not the same. It's fundamentally different.
It's because of the measures, like kind of not letting people out of home and just.
You don't think the process by which those measures are adopted and chosen is important? I think it's of massive importance.
Yeah, you're right in that terms. What about like reusable energy and recycling? Like, what are your comments on that? Do you think that's like people like will focus on like much more.
I think one thing that's interesting, you know, there's a lot of discussion about, you know, falls in pollution and reduced air travel will be fantastic for the climate. You know, in some sense, it's a natural experiment in strategies which will reduce global warming. You know, that a lot of global warming is caused by, you know, all of these economic activities that are contracting, airplanes, you know, so that's all going down. So actually, you know, as scientists, what are the consequences of that? Like, we can actually try to look at, you know, it's a natural experiment it's not designed, you know, we're not doing it because we want to reduce global warming or stop climate change. We're doing it for a different reason. But it has the consequence that it massively reduces many of the pollutants and, you know, that create global warming and climate change. So I think it could be fascinating because we'll actually understand much better, you know, how the climate responds to these type of measures. You know, we'll have scientific evidence that, you know, in some sense is very speculative at the moment, or it's generated by models, you know, but this will be a real global experiment. So I actually find that really interesting. You know, we may find that actually it's much easier to stop climate change or stop global warming than we thought before, you know. So I think actually it's unprecedented learning opportunity from that perspective. I mean, that seems to me to be the main issue with respect to the environment, you know, and so that's exciting, I think. I mean, you know, well, it's potentially exciting. We don't know what it will find, but I think it's a great learning opportunity.
Yeah, I agree with that point. Ingelap, maybe you can.
The question is about a little bit about history and the history of crisis, actually. So in the history of mankind, has there ever been a country that has benefited from crisis, any kind of economic crisis, not only similar to COVID-19, but generally, and how these countries have benefited from crisis and leaped forward in terms of economic development? Can you give us any examples, if there are any?
Yeah. No, I think the United States, you know, think about the Great Depression, or think about a lot of Western European countries. You know, the Great Depression, you know, created an enormous change in the attitude of the United States. You know, the whole Roosevelt's New Deal policy was a response. And, you know, despite, you know, my showing that data on the difference between Republicans and Democrats' attitudes toward COVID-19, you know, there is some possibility, I think, you know, that you know, something like the Great Depression, the reaction to the Great Depression will happen here. You know, and I think, you know, if you think about social democracy in Scandinavia, you know, where did social democracy, where did that particular political coalition come from? That was the 1930s. You know, it was the 1930s when Sweden and Norway, you know, came together and created this sort of social democratic coalition. So I think that's you know, that's not so ancient history. You know, that, you know, you can get these positive reactions to these economic crises, so I, you know, as I said, you know, that when I had my grounds for optimism, you know, that could happen, you know, but as I say, you know, it happens at this very unfortunate moment, this populist moment, you know. So, you know, there's all sorts of incentives to take advantage, perverse incentives to take advantage of this. You know, look at Hungary. You know, Viktor Orban in Hungary has used this as an opportunity to kind of strengthen his own personal control of the country, and, you know, so it's complicated.
Thank you for providing your take. Next question, up top, please.
So what do you think, like, considering, I mean, today's situation, the fact that, like, many governments in Europe even, like, failed to show the exact death rates and, like, the number of people from who were, like, affected from coronavirus, COVID-19, I mean, is this kind of an example that people lost their, I mean, how they can believe in the state, I mean, government in this situation, and like afterwards, considering like failure to provide exact figures, and also consider the fact that failure to respond in time, let's say.
Yeah,
So,
I think that in a democracy, there's always perverse short-run incentives for concealing information, and because the incumbent politicians are worried that they'll be blamed, they didn't do more, so their first reaction is, oh, we've got to hide that. And but the thing is, it comes out in a democracy. It comes out, and you learn, and it's messy, but you learn, and you improve. And so I don't think authoritarian systems do better than that. We know very well that the Chinese government has an enormous apparatus to conceal information and repress discussion, and even now there's evidence that they're repressing scientific studies of COVID-19 because they don't like the findings. So I don't think this is really I think it's unfortunate, but that's life, that's politics. There's just these, it's always a messy thing like that, and there's just no perfect solution to that. We're not in the world of Plato's Republic, unfortunately.
Next question will be about what you talked. Actually, it's very related to the idea of natural experiment. So one of the viewers asked a question about fundamental change to the way we will work and live in the future. So I want to elaborate on this question and ask, do you think in terms of finance and economics, will we have different kinds of budget financing or resource allocation by governments and as well as enterprises forever? Or again, could we go back to the pre-crisis way of working and living? Because now we see that we can actually operate online, we can deliver lectures online, we can do lots of works online which were unforeseen. We also witness the fact that we can actually live without holding large conferences or large international events, which are very costly to the national budgets. So people around the world, politicians and businessmen, they organize their meetings online. So I think it goes not bad. So will we have it forever, or?
I think that's actually exciting. It's exciting. Like people are doing all sorts of things like that. Just last night, I got an email from a gentleman who teaches in Hong Kong at a university in Hong Kong saying, oh, they're putting together this webinar with people in Taiwan and Hong Kong and Singapore, and would I like to come and talk, and it's like, it's creating all of these connections. I don't know, in business or other areas, but just within my own life of academia, it's actually creating all these connections, which are very interesting. And I agree with you also, there's many things. I think there will be a lot of hysteresis in that. Many things will go online that wouldn't have been online before, even though it was perfectly feasible technologically. And it'll create all sorts of bridges and connections that otherwise would never have happened. There's a piece of research I like very much about the London Underground, since you were all trained in England. In the London Underground, when there was that bomb and they closed one of the lines, the tube lines, people had to take a different route to work, and then the tube line opened again, and what they discovered was, we're creatures of habit. When you're forced to do something different, you learn it can actually be better than what you were doing to start with. So then it turned out that people they were using very suboptimal routes to go to work. But when you close the tube line, you had to experiment, and then you actually learn, oh, you know what, it's actually much easier to go through Oxford Circus, and so maybe we're in a moment like that where we're sort of knocked out of our usual way of behaving, and we're actually going to learn how to do things better and take advantage better of all this fantastic modern technology. So I agree. I think that's exciting. I'm just going to move because my wife has to come and teach. So I'm just moving.
No problem.
Yes.
So we'll have next question.
Okay. Ben on. Okay.
The next question, actually we have 10 minutes left, so we'll have 2 more questions, then we can end the session. My floor is my colleagues, please, up top.
So we've got questions about question about like foreign aid. How do you see the role of international organization, also like aid organization, providing it after the crisis? I mean, will there be any changes in the way that it's provided, or also like to the sector that is provided in the future?
I'm not sure I have a. I'm not really a scholar of foreign aid. I'm not quite sure what my opinion about that is. I'm sure that, you know, there's going to be enormous challenges in developing countries, you know, with respect to providing healthcare and, you know, dealing with, you know, macroeconomic problems, you know, falling commodity prices, you know, enormous contraction of trade and commodity exports and natural resource exports that many developing countries are reliant on. So there's going to be an enormous fiscal problem. So I would guess there's a huge role for international institutions like the International Monetary Fund in supporting developing country governments and helping them, you know, in this crisis, and kind of debt forgiveness or debt postponement. You know, I guess it's very difficult when so many developed countries are facing challenges. It's difficult for, you know, the International Monetary Fund to focus on that. But I haven't really thought about that too much. But I can see that there's a big role. There's going to be many challenges there. Yes.
Thank you. One last question will be about universal basic income, and that's the idea we have. Lots of people have been talking about it in the scientists and non-scientists, economists. Do you think we will see much faster or much faster implementation of universal basic income? Actually, the actual implementation of universal basic income, given that lots of the jobs will be probably gone for some time before they come back. It's uncertain, of course, but what's your take on this?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I really know, you know, that, I mean, there's been there was this recent experience of this system being introduced in Finland. You know, there was a pilot experiment of that in Finland, which as I understand it was abandoned, you know, that it wasn't terribly successful. And, you know, so I haven't seen I haven't really seen a kind of evaluation. I haven't looked at a detailed evaluation of what went on in Finland. I think that would be interesting, just sort of trying to, I guess people are just trying to understand basically, you know, what are the incentives of this, you know, how does this affect people's incentives? And of course, the idea is that, you know, it provides people income without influencing, you know, their incentives to participate in the labor market, without creating perverse incentives. And so that seems like a very good thing to me. I don't know, you know, how fiscally feasible that is, and, you know, it's not something I've studied myself, so I'm not quite sure I understand what the budget consequence, the government you know, what the consequences for the government budget are of something like that. But I do think, you know, it's a moment to think very broadly about what sort of mechanisms of social insurance, you know, are adequate for dealing with a shock of this size. You know, I think, of course, you know, it's very hard to imagine, you know, it's so un-American, you know, something like that. You know, there's still, you know, there's you know, when you're a European like me, you know, when you first move to the United States, you know, it's difficult to, you know, you have to understand how people, the logic of the United States is very different from the logic of Britain. You know, there's still very much this kind of logic of self-made people and social mobility and the American dream, which is kind of regarded as a sort of silly cliche in England. But actually, when you get to the United States, it's actually the kind of reality of the way many people think. So there's very much this ideology of self-reliance here and self-improvement, and you know, so I think there'd be a lot of political resistance to something like that in the United States, but other places, you know, I think it would be very interesting to look in detail at this Finnish experience and try to understand what they concluded about that, but I'm not sure I know the answer.
Thank you. I believe we have asked most of the questions. We have some, and we do apologize from the viewers that we will not be able to ask your questions with the time limitations. So on behalf of everyone working at our team and on behalf of all Azerbaijani viewers, I express my gratitude to you for accepting our invitation. Very useful information for us, and we hope we will have another webinar video in the future, and we hope we will see Azerbaijani translation of Why Nations Fail very soon.
Yes, me too.
Certainly be sold very fast here.
Okay, great, wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Yeah.